Finance Minister Tito Mboweni is set to deliver his mid-term budget policy statement later this month against a tumultuous economic backdrop. Mboweni says the new economic recovery plan will not take South Africa anywhere unless the government acts decisively to implement it. Reserve Bank Governor Leseta Kganyago has also reiterated that the government must focus on structural reforms such as fixing Eskom to boost economic growth. Expectations are high and threats an array of issues to look out for. Economist Dr. Nthabiseng Moleko joins us now to discuss Mboweni's biggest challenges. Thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it, Doctor. Just want to find out from you, these big challenges that Tito Mboweni faces, what are they, considering that COVID-19 has put everything, has thrown everything into disarray?
Thank you so much for having me, and good morning to everyone listening. Firstly, I think the biggest problem and challenge that we have is the immediate economic shock that COVID has resulted in a massive contraction of more than 51% GDP. And also what you're going to see is the subsectors that have contracted in the main between 10 to 90% across the economic cluster. So you're seeing, as a result, wage declines, income declines, and really a contracting of your household aggregate demand. Business enterprises are not really producing the level of output that they are able to. I think in the back of this is the existing recession that we had in South Africa. So in the main, economic policy has been unable to drive economic growth prior to COVID. COVID has simply accentuated or rather worsened the already very bad plight of the economic status of South Africa.
And then in terms of dealing with the big parastatals, the big companies, Eskom, SAA, even the Post Bank was needing much needed money a few days ago. How do you think the finance minister is going to deal with that or address that?
Well, we know in terms of the economic recovery program, I want us to go back to your first question and link it to the second. You said, what are the key challenges? The biggest challenge in light of what I've just said is that we're not growing. We are not growing. We have an estimated growth rate of 1%. It's contracted now between 7.2 and 8, depending on who you listen to. But in the main, South Africa's contraction is much larger than most African economies in sub-Saharan Africa. And this is because of the type of growth path we have had. So we've had a contracting primary sector, contracting industrial sector or secondary sector, and mainly a services-led growth trajectory. Now, in the main, what you would want is you would want to use the state arm to boost your primary and your secondary sectors. Why? Because you have more than 10 million South Africans that are unemployed. You need to boost your labor absorptive or high employment intensity sectors. And in the main, private sector participation is much needed, but the state is the arm that is able to absorb the market failures. So what you would want to see is what had happened prior to 1994. South Africa was able to use state entities like Denel, state entities like Eskom, other state entities to actually ensure that they deal with the massive unemployment in the country. But you must match that with good governance. You must match that with efficiencies. You must match that with cost recovery in these state-owned enterprises. So I think the Minister of Finance going forward definitely needs to look at how to revive the economy, number one. That is key. If there's no economic recovery plan, we are not necessarily going to boost the revenue that is needed to fund the fiscus. We're not necessarily going to mitigate the debt to GDP levels that are very high. We're not going to deal with the budget deficit, which is widening on the main because we're not growing. So we've got to grow the economy. Second, you can use the state entities to drive up productivity, to deal with labor absorption, and to absorb market failures. So we've got to improve the efficiencies of our state-owned enterprises. I don't necessarily believe that we have to be a free market economy. We have to have a mix in South Africa because of the historical inequalities, the massive levels of poverty, and also the inability of our capital-intensive, or rather our primary and secondary sector, to absorb in the main your masses of our low-skilled employees and our low-skilled economic entrants. And we need to transform those using the state. So we must improve efficiency of our state vehicles. We must ensure that those state vehicles are improved in terms of governance, but we cannot eradicate them because the private sector is not necessarily going to be able to respond to the South African issues in terms of economically and structurally. So we must use them in a better way and function them make sure that they function better in terms of outcomes.
Dr. Nthabiseng, my next question is about this economic recovery plan once more. Let's say the plan is put into place and everything is executed accordingly. When do you think the economy will be out of the doldrums and will start recovering and stop contracting and actually start picking up?
Okay, so I think let's talk about the fundamentals of the economic recovery plan. We have to have necessary fundamentals in that plan because the current economic policies we must accept. Prior COVID, we had a recession twice. Prior COVID, we had 10 million unemployed South Africans. Prior COVID, we weren't able to have transformative outcomes in the South African economy. In the main, your rural economies, your township economies are not integrated into your market economy. Therefore, you need to use different instruments. So that economic recovery plan needs to have a review. Your trade policy, monetary policy definitely need to be reviewed to drive productive sectors, to drive a strong standing renewables energy sector that is transforming, that is including new entrants, black economic entrants in the main, new SMMEs into new industries. And I think your fiscal instruments, we are currently targeting a 230 billion surplus. If you look at the pre-supplementary budget review that was issued by the minister in June, the net non-interest expenditure increase is actually 36 billion. A lot of people are citing 500 billion. The net increase after reprioritization, after you look at what happened out of that shock and not have a free fall, they actually implement expansionary fiscal policy, expansionary monetary policy, and they make sure that their public debt to GDP ratios, even if they are worsened, they drive productive growth, they drive productive sectors so that in the long run, which is what you're asking, you can actually drive economic growth. If you don't do something now with the shock that the COVID has come with, in the light of a non-growing economy, we're in a low growth trap, you're likely to worsen the free fall and you're likely to worsen the length of our time. So if we do implement an economic recovery plan, it must change the austerity type of approach that is being implemented. It must be labor absorptive. It must be inclusive of township and rural economies. It must advance rural development, agrarian reform, and productive growth of all your manufacturing subsectors. In the main, particularly those low-scale manufacturing sectors that can absorb hundreds of thousands of our youth, black women, and also those who are on the economic fringes. So in how long it takes is usually 18 to 24 months in the short, depending on the stimulus package that you put in place. The success of your stimulus package you must measure. What I would propose is that economic recovery plan needs institutions and also an economic coordinating council that oversees the execution of targeted interventions and programs that are actually going to drive transformation across the board in local level, national level, state agencies, and everyone must agree to these deliverables with the private participation and also your civil society overseeing some of these key drivers. So I think we have to have some kind of coordinating council. We've never had that. There's kind of a free fall happening. National Treasury is going to come with a medium-term budget policy statement. If it stays in terms of the current economic framework with no necessarily coordinative drive, with no targeted priorities and interventions to drive up your manufacturing value add, your primary sectors, you are likely to not see much change in the outcomes of South Africa's economy. We've got to change the way in which we behave to see different outcomes.
In conclusion, in 30 seconds, in the past interest rate cuts, have they played a role in helping with the recovery, and will they continue playing a role? And do you think another interest rate cut is necessary?
So the monetary policy framework is what you're talking about. So the South African Reserve Bank has had a 275 basis point cut in the last few weeks because in response to COVID. Yes, definitely. Interest rate cuts improve aggregate demand. They lower the cost of loans. They leave room for household incomes to be used to consume, and that kind of kickstarts your economy. I think that the monetary policy, though, can be much more aggressive in terms of driving economic outcomes. If they were aggressive, I would say full employment should be something that is reviewed as a target. If the Fed, which is the U.S. Federal Reserve Bank, can target full employment with the size of economy they have, with the low level of unemployment, and we as South Africa are saying we don't want to even consider that because of the status of our Reserve Bank, I think we need to look at our objectives in terms of monetary policy, because we have a crisis that is a labor market crisis on our hands right now, and we cannot ignore the plight of more than 10 million South Africans. In the last quarter alone, we know 2.2 million South Africans lost their work, and 42% unemployment rate. Expanded definition, let's forget the narrow. We cannot continue along this trajectory if we are to change the economic outcomes. And I think the monetary policy has an important role to play in terms of expanding our impact across the board. And I think they must come on board.
Dr. Nthabiseng Moleko, we'll leave it right there. Thank you so much for your time. That was economist Dr. Nthabiseng Moleko providing an overview of what we can expect in the next month's upcoming medium-term budget policy statement set to be delivered by Finance Minister Tito Mboweni.